Hello, my name is Marat, and you are watching Marat in real life. This is my second video I am releasing on my channel, and it's probably the most important video I will ever make. I plan to be unscripted for the most part, but this story has been 5 years in the making, and so I owe it to you, I owe it to myself, to organize all of this as best I can. Today, April 20th, 2025, is the 5-year anniversary of the first day I started to develop symptoms of what I later came to learn was herpes simplex encephalitis. So, on April 20th, 2020, is when the symptoms started, and 2 days before, on April 18th, 2020, I took Sildenafil, also known by its brand name Viagra, for the first time in my life. Now, I want to make clear that what I'm about to tell you is a true story, but it's also quite unbelievable because there is very little proof outside of my own personal experience and the evidence of the battle I have been fighting with brain injury for the past 5 years, which I have no doubt resulted from the encephalitis. Also, I have to provide this disclaimer. I am not a doctor, I am not a physician, and nothing you hear in this video should be interpreted as medical advice. I am not offering medical advice. I am offering life advice based on my life and my having lived it. I do have a little bit of a medical background, and I'm going to briefly touch on that later on. But what I'm about to tell you is simply the history of my experience. What happened to me? I'm a patient, much like many of you might have been a patient at one time or another. But my situation is extremely rare, if non-existent altogether. And I think you might agree with me once you've seen and heard everything. This rarity makes things in the medical world difficult for me to manage and to navigate. I used to think that a story like mine would get more attention from doctors and they would be excited and interested in helping me. But in fact, the opposite has proven to be true. It seems that the more outstanding the case or the condition, in actuality, the less attention it gets. I know that powers that be are not going to be happy about this video being released and my story being told. Pfizer is not going to be happy about it. The pharmaceutical companies are not going to be happy about it. The hospitals are probably not going to be very happy that my story is being told, that this information is being made available to all of you, to the public, that I'm telling my truth right now. They're not going to be happy. And I suspect when those interests start complaining to Google, this video might be taken down. It might not happen this week. It might not happen next week. Might not happen in a month. I don't know. But I do implore whoever is watching this video right now, please share it, copy it and paste it, comment on it, make reaction videos about it. Whatever you can do to get this story out there. You know, however embarrassing it is to me at this point, whatever the consequences are, I really don't care. It doesn't matter to me anymore. This is what the situation has brought me to. And I really think that the truth is more important than a single man. I also understand that I am setting myself up for ridicule. I'm setting myself up for the haters, for the bots and the social media watchdogs out there of the big interests. Once again, I'm setting myself up for embarrassment, possibly financial ruin. But, I just can't live like this anymore. I can't live in the shadows like this. I have been gaslighted, ad infinitum about my experience by at least 10 doctors. And after 5 years, only my insomnia is admittedly somewhat under control. And as you'll soon see, it's possible that the only reason any of this happened to me in the first place, the way that it did, is so I could talk about this very real and potentially very important experience that I had. I actually made a similar video last year on the same anniversary, the 20th of April, 2024, but I didn't release that video. I only had the laptop mic, as a microphone. I only had the laptop camera, which is 720p. So, the sound and video quality wasn't that great. I was concerned about it. I really wanted you guys to hear my voice, to see my eyes, so that you could understand that what I'm telling you is the truth. What I'm really hoping for is that researchers will get involved. A study will be conducted, maybe multiple studies. Data will be gathered, and potentially new treatment methods might become available, so that someone out there will be helped eventually because of my experience in this story I have to tell. Once again, it might not happen this year. It might not happen next year. It might not happen in 10 years. But if all of this leads to somehow saving a life somewhere someday, then, all of my suffering these past 5 years might have been worth it in the end. What we really need, we need more data. So let's get into it. I want you to first understand how it is I came to take the Viagra, all right? So that you can grip the depth and the breadth of my experience and get the whole story. I was never what you would call a Viagra enthusiast. To be honest, it was something I was trying to avoid my entire life. It was not something I tried or did occasionally. I never even really thought about taking any Viagra. I never needed it. I never had any problems. And so it really wasn't a part of my makeup. It wasn't a part of my routine. But then, I think it was October 31st or maybe November 1st, 2018, I woke up in the morning and had an incredible urge to cry. I started thinking about an ex-girlfriend of mine who I loved very much from like 15 years before. And I missed her. And so I started crying. I really didn't think much about it at the time. It didn't really bother me. I just thought a depressive episode might be coming on. I have every reason to believe that, I have been dealing with bipolar disorder for, at that point, probably about 30, maybe 35 years. And, I thought I was entering a depressive episode. I wasn't surprised by it. It had happened a few times before, but, I really didn't have a good reason for it other than just, thinking about my ex-girlfriend. So, I thought nothing more of it. But then again, it happened that same day. And again, I didn't think much about it. 2 crying episodes in a day is not uncommon for anyone. But then it happened again the next day. I had another 2 crying episodes that very next day. And these weren't just little bouts of crying that I'm talking about. This was significant. I was bawling. All right. It was quite violent crying. But again, I thought, okay, I'm definitely in the midst of a depressive episode. This will subside. This will go away. Give it another few days. I might stop crying tomorrow. Everything is fine. And then this pattern of behavior continued for the next 6 weeks. All right. So every day for the next 6 weeks, I was crying violently, at least twice a day and as many as 4 times a day. And every single time I was thinking about the same ex-girlfriend. This had never happened to me before. It was uncontrollable. It was uncontrollable. I couldn't stop it. And I thought I was losing my mind. I thought this situation would go on forever. I would keep crying forever. it was really bothering me. I never, ever had such a prolonged period of violent, uncontrollable crying before in my entire life. Even after breaking up with my first love, 20 years before, when I was 24, even after my father's death, which came the next year. And what I immediately noticed during the crying period is that I had no sexual ideation whatsoever. For 6 weeks, I had no arousal, which was unusual for me. And what was even more unusual is that after this 6-week crying period, I emerged with substantial sexual dysfunction, including erectile dysfunction, which I can only really describe as being paralytic. Okay? The sexual function did not actually return at all until about a month after the crying episode had subsided. So this was in mid-December 2018. Remember, I had a 6-week crying episode, which was over in mid-December 2018. It started like November 1st, 2018. And so, when the sexual function did return, it was obvious to me that the erectile function was somehow partially paralyzed. I never had any kind of erectile or sexual dysfunction before in my entire life, and it was concerning for me. What I also noticed that along with the sexual dysfunction came extreme fatigue. And for the next year and a half, until I developed the encephalitis, I was sleeping about 12 hours a day. Sometimes I would sleep 16 hours a day because of this extreme fatigue, after the crying episode, after the paralytic sexual function. And another thing that I found out after the crying period is that I had lost a large part of my libido. Okay? And with that, I had lost a large part of my motivation. I was not very interested in taking care of myself anymore the way I had been before. I used to go to the gym, 2018, 2019. I used to go to the gym like 4 to 6 times a week for, 3 to 5 hours per session. I was a bit of a gym rat, and, I had all the pre-workout. I had all the post-workout concoctions. I had a personal trainer for a few months. I really loved my Zumba classes. Sometimes I would take 2 classes in a day, or I would take a Zumba class and then I would take some kind of, strength training class or strength building class. Then I would hit the weights and, etc. But after that 6-week period of crying, and probably mostly due to the extreme fatigue, I was no longer very interested in going to the gym as much as I had been before. Also, I realized that I was no longer aroused by the sight of a beautiful woman. I was no longer aroused by any kind of sexual ideation, or at least very mildly aroused. It was strange. I'd never experienced something like that before. Unfortunately, I didn't have much time to dwell on it because, a month into recovery, this was mid-January 2019. So, I didn't have much time to think about what happened to me because on January, I think it was 15th, 2019, I got a call from a Hoosier Medical Center in Cleveland, Ohio. Okay. My father was in the hospital. He was in ICU. He had had a septic rupture because of an exacerbated case of colon cancer. And basically he was dying. So for the next 8 months, I flew back and forth between Los Angeles and Cleveland, Ohio. And a number of times, tending to my dad, taking care of his end-of-life affairs. I was really trying to help him get back on his feet. It was a complete horror show. I'm going to make another video about that some other time. It's a long story. But, 7 months later, on July 20th, 2019, he did in fact pass away. I had a memorial service for him in August. came back to Los Angeles, and, you know, for the next few months, I was doing some pretty serious grieving. You know, I love my dad. I love my dad a lot. We had grown estranged over the course of the last 10 years, but, you know, that's all left for another video again. So then, I think it was sometime in November or December 2019, I finally got around to trying to figure out what it is that happened to me. You know, why did I have the crying episodes? Why did I have the sexual dysfunction? Why was my libido, you know, non-existent for the most part? Why did I have this extreme fatigue? And, you know, I started to make appointments with some urologists. You know, ultimately, at the end of the whole story, I went to 3 urologists. You know, I knew by that time that some kind of neurological problem had caused all of this. And I suspected that I had some kind of weird stroke or weird aneurysm, maybe. So I went to the urologists thinking they would have something useful for me in terms of, you know, some kind of neurological help. I was, however, disappointed. The first urologist I went to, I think his name was Dr. Bateman. He was out in West Hills. He was not the nicest guy, you know, even though, you know, I paid him out of pocket like $250. You know, he seemed like he was not that happy to see me. And when I brought up, you know, my suspicion of a neurological origin to my sexual dysfunction, he appeared to get a little bit upset. Anyways, he looked at my numbers. I had blood tests recently because I thought maybe my sexual dysfunction was caused by like possibly some kind of venereal disease, some kind of STD I picked up somewhere. You know, I wasn't sexually active, so I don't know where this could have come from. But regardless, you know, I was cautious. So I had the blood test taken. I had some STD tests taken. You know, everything came back as expected. I didn't have anything except the herpes that I already knew I had, the herpes type 2. You know, I had some mild thyroid issues. Some of my numbers were a little bit off. But, you know, it was also slight that I felt I couldn't explain, you know, the drastic onset of my sexual dysfunction or the persistent fatigue and the loss of libido motivation. So I still couldn't explain it. You know, Dr. Bateman seemed to think that my sexual dysfunction was due to low testosterone levels. Okay. You know, my testosterone, I think it was about 450 to 550. It wasn't too bad. It was, you know, a little over half of what it was supposed to be for a man my age. So, and I told him that my testosterone levels had probably been the same for a long period of time. You know, I had earlier blood tests to back all that up. But, you know, regardless, he still thought that the sexual dysfunction, the erectile dysfunction, was due to low T levels. And he recommended testosterone replacement therapy. Later, I found out that, you know, after reading some reviews about this doctor, that he recommends testosterone replacement therapy to all of his patients, if not, you know, the vast majority of them. And the reason he does this is because he might be getting some compensation on the back end from these testosterone replacement therapy companies that he's working with. And so, you know, I was looking for a neurological cure of some kind, but this doctor didn't have anything for me, obviously. So I went on to the next urologist. The next urologist, the Cedars-Sinai guy, and once again, I don't remember his name, but he was a lot better for me than the first guy. He also didn't respond very favorably to questions and assertions regarding, you know, neurological erectile sexual dysfunction. And he did, however, have 2 other options for me. So I had already rejected the TRT idea, and I was right in doing so, I think, seeing as how, you know, I looked at the blood work myself. And, you know, it clearly showed a vitamin D3 deficiency that, you know, Dr. Bateman had completely missed. So I started supplementing with vitamin D3. I had another blood test. I think it was 3 or 4 months later. And my numbers came back. They were in great shape. Once again, I have evidence of that as well. My testosterone, I think it shot up to like 800, 900. And that minor thyroid issue I was having, that was completely resolved. My numbers were in great shape. Honestly, they couldn't be better. So, anyways, the options this second urologist laid out for me were the following. One, I could get what's called a penis pump implant. Okay. And I immediately understood that this was probably going to be a painful and possibly unpredictable procedure that I really did not want to undertake. And the second option he laid out for me was sildenafil, Viagra, or tadalafil. Okay. Now, mind you, he didn't explain to me the way these medications functioned. All right. He gave me no rationale for why I should take them. Again, I had not tried either of them before, but this doctor seemed to think that the tadalafil would help me. And being a good sport, trying to be a good patient, I took the tadalafil prescription. I got home with it. I sat on it for a few days. I never took any. I just threw it out in the trash. The reasoning was that, tadalafil is like extended version Viagra or sildenafil. It's longer lasting, whereas Viagra, only lasts, excuse me, only a few hours. Tadalafil can last a few days. And, seeing as how I'd never tried sildenafil or Viagra before, I really didn't want to take my chances on the tadalafil. And in the long run, I was probably right, based on the way things ultimately panned out. So I threw out the tadalafil, but, the idea of the Viagra, the sildenafil, it really stuck in my mind as being an option for me. I was convinced my erectile dysfunction was neurological, but I was pretty desperate. And, I thought maybe the Viagra would give me some kind of relief. Maybe it would help, my situation even a little bit. I was holding out a lot of hope. And so I think it was on April 2nd or 3rd, 2020, I asked my primary care physician at the time, a Dr. Constantin out in Oakland, California, if he would write me a script for the Viagra. I'd been a patient of Dr. Constantin's at that time for about 4 years, and I really liked him a lot. He was a smart guy, a very curious guy, a diligent guy. He was very attentive, and I think he liked me too. We would talk from time to time. I could reach him on the phone. He would ask me about how I was doing. We would just shoot the breeze sometimes. Really a nice guy. And for me, having an attentive doctor like that, always made me feel like I was in good hands. And that that feeling was healing, in and of its own. It seems to me that a lot of doctors have sort of, either abandoned or, forgotten about the good that bedside manner can do for a patient. It's part of the cure, as much as the medication. Good bedside manner, being attentive, being responsive, showing the patient that they're not alone, that somebody cares about them. It's incredibly important. So anyways, Dr. Constantin, he prescribed the sildenafil, aka the Viagra. And, I sat on the prescription again for about a week, much like I had done with the tadalafil. But finally, I did go and get it filled. I think it was on the 13th or 14th of April, 2020. I got the prescription, and I sat on it some more. I think I sat on it for another 4 or 5 days or a week or something like that. Debating, how I was going to take it, whether I was going to take it. Should I take it with a young lady? What if it doesn't work? That's obviously going to be a little bit embarrassing. Do I want to go through that? So anyways, ultimately, I decided that I was going to experiment with the sildenafil on my own. I was just going to try it out, see if it, made any difference in the quality of my erections. So finally, I think, once again, I think it was April 18th. I have no doubt, April 18th, 2020. For the first time in my life, I took 50 milligrams of sildenafil, also known as Viagra. The doctor had prescribed 100 milligram dose tablets, and so I took half of one of those tablets, only 50 milligrams. And the doctor, my doctor didn't really give me any kind of dosing guidelines. He said I could start with the 50. He prescribed the 100. He thought that would be good for me. So actually, after taking the Viagra, the sildenafil, I went on a little jog for about 15 or 20 minutes, I think it was, just to kind of simulate sexual activity, get all the blood pumping, get the blood flow going. And then I got back home and I proceeded to, try to achieve erection. But again, I was disappointed. The Viagra had absolutely no noticeable effect on the quality of my erection. I knew it was working because my skin got a little bit warmer. I was flush. I was getting the tingles a little bit. And there was no discernible improvement in my erection quality. Just none, And this again helped to confirm my suspicions that the sexual dysfunction was neurological in origin and had a neurological cause. You see, Viagra, sildenafil, tadalafil, Levitra, Cialis, they are all medications in the class of what's called PDE5 inhibitors, which function on the cardiovascular level primarily, and not on the neurological level. Men seem to think, and the industry advertises Viagra or sildenafil, tadalafil, as being kind of like these universal panacea, for any kind of erectile dysfunction that might plague you. But that's not entirely true. In fact, if you have neurological sexual dysfunction or erectile dysfunction, such as the kind I have, the PDE5 inhibitors, the sildenafil, the Viagra, the tadalafil, they're not going to do anything for you. It's really a lost cause. So of course I was disheartened. I never took the sildenafil again. And 2 days later, once again on April 20th, 2020, is when the symptoms of what I know now could only be encephalitis started. The first such symptom was a complete loss of erectile function. I could not achieve erection. I didn't have any nighttime erections. None of that was there. And the second symptom was this collection of these tiny headaches that I had all over the place. They would come and go. They would pop out at random locations. And what I later learned is that this symptom of these multiple tiny headaches all over the place, this is actually what's called a constellation of headaches. So if you ever experience anything similar to what I just described, then it's a good idea to tell your doctor that what you're going through is a constellation of headaches. And at that point, using that terminology, they will have a better understanding of what it is you're going through and what it is that might be going on with you. So then additional symptoms started to compound once again over the course of the next 3 weeks. I started urinating about 10 to 15 times a day. I have some documentation on that as well. I'm assuming because, my body was trying to purge itself of whatever infection it was going through at the time. And I experienced paralysis in both my arms, my forearms and my hands simultaneously, which made me think I was having, possibly another stroke, that like the kind that I had, which partially paralyzed my sexual function. And I started having semi-seizures, like waking seizures, where, I was wide awake, I was fully conscious, but my body was just shaking completely uncontrollably. And I also had unstable temperature control. I would either get really hot or really cold, but the temperature in the room hadn't changed, so I didn't understand why I was shivering or why I was, starting to sweat. I got these strange taste sensations, as if like new parts of my brain became available to taste new things. It was very odd. I had been a smoker for many years at that point, and I was trying to quit. I was down to about one cigarette a day, if you can believe it. I know I can't. And but that cigarette that I would smoke, it was as if I could taste every single chemical in that cigarette. I'd never had anything like that before. It was absolutely disgusting. It was absolutely disgusting. Cigarettes had never tasted that way before for me in my life. Um, Along with that, I had some fluid buildup, kind of like around the cartilage around both ears. I thought it, later on down the line, I thought it might have been like cerebral spinal fluid that was building up around my ears. I still don't know what it was. But I've never had that happen to me before, and I also had like pooling of fluid in the extremities, so in my hands and in my legs. I remember I took a picture of my foot in a sock right around that time, and you could see the flesh bulging around the elastic. I mean, it was pretty bad, and it's never been bad like that before. It's never been bad like that since. Excuse me. And this pooling of blood in the extremities, this went on for an extended period of time into my recovery. I think it was probably about a year or so into recovery that I was going through that. And the fatigue that I had experienced, after the paralytic sexual function, after the crying episodes, of what I suppose was some kind of mild or weird stroke. The fatigue became worse, and sometime between the second or third week, I started having difficulty sleeping and staying asleep. The insomnia, which later became intense, extreme, had started. The insomnia had started. Also, for some strange reason, I had a couple days with like really fantastic wit. I don't know where this came from, but really fantastic wit. I was able to form, these ideas and use words that I probably hadn't used in like 20 or 30 years, probably not since my teens, not since high school. And for some reason, my mind started conjuring these words I hadn't used in forever. Didn't understand why that was going on. It was very strange, and um, possibly like the function of some kind of much deeper level survival instinct that kind of appeared or manifested. And finally, my lymph nodes in my right hip, they felt like they were tender, and I had this distinct feeling like my brain was swollen or inflamed. It honestly felt like somebody had taken my brain out of my skull, scraped it along the ground or the sidewalk a few times, and placed it back in my head. That's what it felt like. That's honestly, what it felt like at that time. And that feeling continued actually into my recovery for a number of months. Now, I had known about encephalitis probably ever since high school, okay? I was an excellent biology student, and it was my favorite subject. I remember for my senior biology final, I wrote a 26-page thesis on HIV, its mechanisms, discoveries, therapeutics, just a general overview of the entire HIV situation. Don't forget, this is like 1992, 1993. HIV is really prevalent in society, in the population. So that was something I gravitated towards because I thought I could have the most impact. So that's really why I wrote that paper. But anyways, I had known about brain inflammation, probably since I was 16 years old. Also, I was pre-med for my first year at Acton University before, I dropped out of pre-med, and I concluded that medicine really wasn't for me. But, then I spent a few years searching my soul, went into computer science instead, and did a little bit of electrical engineering. And, that's what I've been doing for the last 20 years, 25 years. That's what I've been doing. So when I started to realize that what I was dealing with was brain inflammation, encephalitis, also known as encephalitis. I didn't know what kind I was having at the time, but that was the situation in all likelihood. And, when my symptoms, they kind of reached their crescendo, I started talking to my friends about it. And, it honestly felt like I was dying. It honestly felt like I was dying. So when I was talking to my friends, I was kind of saying goodbye, looking for any kind of advice I could get from anybody about what to do with the situation. All this time, I had not gone to the hospital. I had not gone to emergency, and I had not sought medical help. And I'll tell you why. It was May 2020. It was the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. The hospitals were on lockdown. They were overwhelmed. Everyone was concerned that if they went to hospital, they went to emergency, they would contract COVID. Everybody was worried about that, so I didn't want to take my chances. I thought my situation is bad enough as it is. If I go to hospital, if I go to emergency and get COVID, things are just going to get a lot worse for me. That's how I was thinking about it. So I suffered with the symptoms, simply hoping that they would just go away on their own, that I was having some kind of weird episode and all of this would subside. It did not, however. Things only got steadily worse. And, in so saying, by telling you about this, that I did not go to emergency, I'm also implying that I do not have an official diagnosis for herpes simplex encephalitis. I don't. I freely admit that, I'm perfectly at peace with that fact. And the reason I'm at peace with that fact is, because I didn't go to emergency, because I didn't seek medical aid, this story I'm telling you right now, and the involvement of turmeric, would have never been possible. Okay? It would have never happened. I would have just gone to the hospital, been treated in hospital, spent several weeks on an Acyclovir drip, would have had a substantial hospital bill, would have had to, be away from work, away from family, away from everything for a number of weeks, if not a number of months. I'd have to have a lumbar puncture on MRI. It was quite a lengthy process. And once again, if I had gone through all of that, I wouldn't be able to be here right now and talk about turmeric and what it did for me. I wouldn't, I probably wouldn't even have connected the sildenafil and the encephalitis. I wouldn't have ever made that connection. So all of this, it's either incredibly ironic or this is Providence of some kind that we're dealing with here. Now, finally, it was my friend Boki who saved my life. And she's the reason I'm here today to tell this story. She said, Marat, if you think you have some kind of brain inflammation, then take some turmeric. I thought she was crazy. I thought she was totally loony. I thought she was bonkers. I thought she had not been listening to these 13 symptoms I had been rattling off to her. I thought she wasn't listening about the severity of, my situation. I had 13 symptoms. I had 13 symptoms compounding over 3 weeks, and she's telling me that, some spice that I can get off the rack at the grocery store is going to be able to deal with all that for me. This is what she was telling me. Once again, I thought she was nuts. But, I was quite desperate at the time. and thought about it for a day. Then on Friday, May 10th, 2020, 3 weeks into my ordeal, 9 days from my 45th birthday, I think it was around at 11 p.m., 10:30, 11, I took 2 large tablespoons of turmeric, put them in a glass with milk, with some honey, warmed it all up in the microwave, and drank it down. Then I tried to go to sleep. And a miracle happened. A miracle happened. It's either a miracle, or it's science. And I'm of the impression that it's actually the science playing itself out here. The miracle is tangential in order to help reveal, the scientific quality of my story, which I'm going to get into here shortly. So anyways, make a long story short. It's a long story, but I'm probably not going to make it any shorter. But to kind of round out this episode, I woke up that next morning. It was Saturday morning, the 11th of May. I woke up that Saturday morning, and I felt like 90% of my symptoms were gone. Gone. Okay? I actually felt normal again. All right? My erections returned. The nighttime erections returned. I didn't have paralysis in my arms anymore. I was still urinating 5 to 10 times a day, probably because the body was still trying to clean itself out. But it felt like the inflammation had gone away. It felt like my brain was no longer, inflamed. And that was the most important part for me, I think. Now it was just trying to heal. So, my ears, they no longer had that fluid buildup. That had gone away in a night. I had stable temperature control. The cigarettes didn't taste weird anymore. I didn't have any headaches. It was amazing. I felt like $1 million. Once again, for the first time in 3 weeks, I felt normal again. Really remarkable. And I still can't believe it to this day that it worked out the way it did for me. If Bucky hadn't entered the picture, if I hadn't taken that turmeric, if all my symptoms didn't resolve so quickly, I'd probably be dead right now. I wouldn't be around right now if it wasn't for Bucky, if it wasn't for the turmeric. Once again, I had no faith that it was going to work. The turmeric would work at all. But, I was desperate. I didn't know what else to do. This seemed to be my only option. It's something I could do. And so yeah, I took the turmeric, and the very next morning, 90% of my symptoms were gone. Now, I continued dosing with the turmeric for the next several nights. I think it was the next 3 or 4 nights I continued dosing. But, beyond that initial relief after the first night, there wasn't much benefit on the additional nights. It seems that first night, the turmeric did the majority of its work. Okay, if not all of it. And that first night was the most crucial. As a precautionary measure, I continued dosing for a few more nights, but once again, there was very little, additional benefit. And I thought all my symptoms would resolve after that night, but that's not what happened. New symptoms actually started to emerge. And they weren't really new. They were partly some of the same symptoms I had, but they got worse. Some new symptoms did emerge, such as the insomnia, and within a week of the encephalitis, I realized that, my situation had actually worsened substantially. That extreme fatigue that I had after the supposed stroke, this had morphed into an absolutely devastating, all-consuming insomnia. Okay, and I was sleeping about 1 to 2 hours a night, and it was very bizarre sleep. It was the strangest sleep I've ever had. I've never in my life, I'd never had sexual dysfunction before, as I said earlier, and I had never had any kind of insomnia. I mean, sure, from time to time, earlier on in my software development career, there was a need, to pull some 48 hours, some 72-hour shifts when you're working on resolving a particular bug or solving a particular problem, implementing a feature that's on a deadline. Sometimes you got to work 48, 72 hours straight. So, that's something I'd done a few times before, but that's not insomnia. After those periods, I crashed out like a rock. So this insomnia that I was having, it was completely alien to me. And I also discovered that I had some mild PTSD after the encephalitis. My brain was traumatized, obviously. It was trying to recover. I think it was for the next 3-4 months, I had very vivid nightmares. I definitely had a sensitivity to light and to sound. It was jarring, like a door would close and I would just, shake, and it was startling for me, very startling. And after about 6 months, the PTSD subsided. I had other problems as well. I'm going to get into that here right now. So, I lost the ability to laugh and cry for about the first 3 to 6 months. Couldn't laugh, couldn't cry. Nothing was funny. Nothing was sad. I also thought about my ex-girlfriend the way I had during that 6-week bout of crying that I had. And again, thinking about my girlfriend produced no tears, produced no sadness. I had lost the ability to cry. It was really disturbing. That all came back after a period of months. But it was really kind of only the tip of the iceberg, this crying episode, the PTSD. What I came to learn is that my insomnia that I began to experience was incredibly difficult to manage. And, in my estimation, it's probably as close as anyone is ever going to get to fatal familial insomnia, something you might want to look up, without actually dying. Okay, typically when you get fatal familial insomnia, you die within a year, maybe a year and a half. So I'm probably as close to that as anybody's ever going to get. That's not what I have. That's not my condition. My condition can be managed, even though it's very difficult. But yeah, that was the situation. It was horrible. And this also came with what I learned was an absolutely incomprehensible tolerance to medications. Okay, my erectile dysfunction had also morphed into a more severe sexual dysfunction, which basically robbed me of any pleasure during orgasm. Okay, I really don't get any of that anymore. And my libido had now hit rock bottom. Okay, it was, along with my motivation, my desire for anything, it was at an all-time low, considerably worse than it had been after the supposed stroke. So, that's all fodder for another video. I'm going to go into all of that probably in a recovery video, which is coming soon after this video. And I'm going to talk about, my recovery after the encephalitis, everything that I've been dealing with and so forth. I think it'll be eye-opening for a lot of people. And, but now, let's take a deep dive into all this speculation, okay? Let's take a deep dive using Google search, of course, using some, online resources. Let's take a deep dive into how exactly all this came about. So sometime in 2021, okay, after I had done the rounds with some of the doctors, I had been to 2 psychiatrists, I'd been to 1 endocrinologist, 1 pulmonologist, I saw 3 neurologists, I talked to 2 primary care physicians, I had a very unproductive workup at UCLA Health, and I have documentation of all this, of course. And the doctors, they had no answers for me. They had no answers for me at all. It was then, in 2021, that I had come across this herpes simplex encephalitis condition, all right? So why did this stand out to me in particular? Why did this stand out to me in particular? Because, as I mentioned earlier, for the past 20 years, I had been living with herpes type 2. So the herpes simplex encephalitis seemed like a natural fit for my situation. I suspected I had encephalitis. I knew I had encephalitis. I just didn't know what kind at that point. And the herpes simplex encephalitis seemed to be the target, the target answer for me. So, the herpes, I was infected by it in my early 20s. After dating my first love, we broke up, unfortunately. In the beginning, like the majority of people, I had frequent herpes breakouts. They happened frequently, but those gave way to more infrequent breakouts, which only occurred every 3 or 4 years. And so I was not actively medicating with Acyclovir on a daily basis because, as the doctors had told me, I should really only be medicating when I had an outbreak. And since I only had outbreaks every 3 or 4 years at that time, I was only medicating every 3 or 4 years when I had an outbreak. I mean, that all makes sense. Excuse me. So I understood that herpes simplex encephalitis was most likely what had happened to me, but I still didn't understand what the trigger was. How is it that my pre-existing herpes had now somehow infected my brain? What was the trigger for that? What was the catalyst? It had never happened to me before. It has never happened to me since. So what was it then that that I was doing differently that had possibly caused this herpes simplex encephalitis? And this, however, didn't occur for me for several months. And I think, once again, sometime in 2021, before I saw my neurologist, who I went on to have a 4-year relationship with, sometime in 2021, I entered in Viagra and herpes simplex encephalitis into Google search. On a hunch, on a whim, on a guess, just, seeing maybe there's a connection between the Viagra. That was the only difference in my behavior. Is that for the first time in my life, I took Sildenafil, also known as Viagra. Okay? And then, when I did that search, that's when I stumbled upon it. So now, let's take a look at exactly what I'm talking about here. So what is it that I found? Well, let's go over to Google search here. And if we enter in Viagra and herpes simplex encephalitis, we'll come upon the same article that I came upon 4 years ago. And boy, was I surprised to find it. It's an abstract, and it was buried substantially further down in results than it is now. Now it's at the top of the page when it comes to search results, but I had to put some effort into finding it 4 years ago. And once again, sometime in 2021 is when I stumbled upon it, and here it is right here. And this abstract from the National Library of Medicine, National Center for Biotechnology Information, the NIH, okay, PubMed, here we have an abstract written by 4 doctors or 4 scientists. I'm not sure who these individuals are, but here's what it says. Potential risk of developing herpes simplex encephalitis in patients treated with sildenafil following primary exposure to genital herpes. All right? This was it. This was exactly what I was looking for. And there is only one such article, one such abstract in all of existence, and I happened to find it 4 years ago. After an approximately 1-year battle, a 1-year war with the symptoms that I had after the brain inflammation, after the encephalitis outbreak. So let's take a look at what this abstract says in detail. Let me zoom in here a little bit. And here we can see it clearly says, herpes simplex encephalitis is associated with significant mortality and morbidity As a consequence of HSC, up to 75% of infected individuals die or experience irreversible neurological damage. While the pathogenesis of the disease is unknown, it is traditionally hypothesized that the viral infection occurs by neuronal transmission directly from peripheral sites. Non-neuronal modes of infection have generally been overlooked as the brain is protected by the blood-brain barrier. The BBB, in this case it's not the Better Business Bureau, it's the blood-brain barrier. The BBB poses an effective barrier to pathogens as well as to drugs such as chemotherapies. In the pursuit to deliver chemotherapeutic agents to the brain, several studies demonstrated that phosphodiesterase type 5 inhibitors, PDE5 inhibitors, such as Sildenafil, also known as Viagra, may increase the permeability of the blood-brain barrier, enabling successful delivery of chemotherapeutic agents to the brain. In this communication, we report a case of HSE, Herpes Simplex Encephalitis, in a 62-year-old man, which we suspect was facilitated by the use of sildenafil during a primary genital herpes simple virus HSV infection. Due to the large number of patients treated with PDE5 inhibitors for erectile dysfunction and the high incidence of genital HSV infection in the general population, a larger study should examine the potential risk of developing HSE in patients treated with PDE5 inhibitors. So let me parse this for you. Once again, this abstract was written in 2017, in July to September 2017, 4 years before I had my incident, my infection. So what this says basically is that the blood-brain barrier typically protects you from any kind of viruses or bacteria getting into your brain. Now, recently they've been experimenting with sildenafil as being an agent that can allow the blood-brain barrier to become more permeable, thereby allowing chemotherapeutic delivery of cancer-fighting medications for, victims of brain cancer. I mean, that all makes great sense, but the unforeseen consequence of, this discovery is that other pathogens and other agents can also get into the brain, potentially including herpes as well. And this abstract suggests that that is indeed what's going on. And that is indeed what happened to this 62-year-old man, which is suspected to have, been infected with HSC after taking sildenafil, also known as Viagra. So here we have this evidence. Now, what I want to point out is that this little abstract is the only such paper that exists on this subject, and the only such paper I could find in 4 years of searching. There is no other data. Okay? By all indications, the study that these 5 professionals recommend appears to have never taken place. They never did the follow-on study. And this is one of the reasons why I'm making this video. Okay, I happened to find this abstract at a particularly dire time. Here, let me switch to the other view real quick. So, I happened to find this abstract when I needed it most, okay, when I needed answers more than anything else. And, could it be another coincidence that I just stumbled upon this abstract and it happened to be available at the precise time that I needed it the most? These 5 doctors or scientists, they all had to agree that this is a thing. It's not like, just one guy published a paper. No, 5 individuals came together and they agreed that this is what's going on, okay? And after my experience, I'll tell you, I can only agree with them. I have no doubt. I also understand, however, that, my situation is quite rare. I'm no fool. I'm a reasonable man. Okay. I'm not trying to yell fire in a crowded theater. That's not what I'm doing. Okay. Instead, what I am doing is informing the theater staff, the FDA, Pfizer, the medical community at large, that there is possibly a missing fire extinguisher in the theater, or maybe they don't have any fire extinguishers in the theater at all. That's what I'm doing. Okay? Something I think that they should be, paying attention to and should be aware of and should be concerned about. But, apparently they're not. That's what it seems like to me. So, I understand that there are millions of men out there right now who have herpes type 1 or type 2, have taken sildenafil, and they have not developed herpes simplex encephalitis the way that I did. I can't explain why. It's an astute observation, okay, but it's also a question that needs to be asked and needs to be answered. Why didn't these men contract it? Why did I? Okay, I don't know anything about these other men. Honestly, I don't know. These men, they could be medicating with Acyclovir daily, which is why they didn't get the infection. They obviously have different genetics than I do. Maybe I am somehow allergic to sildenafil, and that's why this happened to me. Once again, I don't know. But if an allergy to sildenafil can create the kind of situation it created for me, well, then the larger medical community needs to know about that. Pfizer needs to do a study about that. We need to find out how often this happens. Okay, and there might be all kinds of men out there who this has also happened to, but they haven't spoken up yet. They haven't made the connection yet between the sildenafil and their herpes simplex encephalitis. There's only that one article available, that one abstract available on the subject. So how could anybody else have put the pieces together? I understand that millions of men, millions of cases of herpes, millions of men taking Viagra and sildenafil. Why didn't this happen to them? I don't know. We need to find out. So apparently, the 62-year-old man in the abstract, he's patient 0, and I might be patient 1. I might be the only one who has enough guts to come out and talk about this, talk about their sexual dysfunction, talk about their herpes, talk about their use of Viagra. Typically, men try to avoid these topics, but here I am openly coming out and talking about it because I think that this situation is of great concern. I wish I would have made this video 5 years ago, but honestly, 5 years ago, I was preoccupied with survival. I was just trying to get by from day to day. I didn't have the time or the capacity to make a video such as this. I was too busy going on doctor's appointments and investigating over 50 over-the-counter and prescription medications. I had my hands full, all right? But I'm very happy that I'm coming out today and making this video. I'm very happy about that. And I hope something's going to be done about it. Now, I want you to understand this as well. How do you suppose that even if I had discovered this instead of making a video, how else could I have informed Pfizer or the FDA or the establishment that I personally had a problem and there might be a larger problem going on over here? Do you think I should have written a letter? Do you think they would have read that letter? No. I think they probably would have just used it as toilet paper. Okay, if opened it at all. I have no faith in their capacity to identify a problem, follow up on a problem when they do find it. No. So that's why I'm coming out and making this very public, although be it a bit of an embarrassing video. But once again, I don't care. I don't care. Okay, this video is a very visceral warning of what's going on. Okay, instead of writing a polite, nicely worded letter that nobody would have read, I am producing this very visceral video instead. That's what I've decided to do. Okay, now let's go on to validate even more of Marat's fantastical story. Let's take a closer look at the turmeric connection, the curcumin connection, with a few simple additional Google search queries. Okay, let's get into it. So first, let's do this query right here. I have it written down on another page. Let's go back here. Let's do this query. Does turmeric or its active ingredient curcumin, hold on a second, I forgot to go back to my web view. Here we are, okay. There's that, and here we have the question, does turmeric or its active ingredient curcumin have an active effect on the herpes virus type 1 or type 2? Let's check it out. Okay, the AI overview is quite clear on the subject. Yes, both turmeric and its active component, curcumin, have shown antiviral activity against herpes simplex virus, HSV types 1 and 2. In laboratory studies. Specifically, curcumin has demonstrated an ability to inhibit viral replication, reduce infectivity, and interfere with the virus's ability to express certain genes. So it's obvious here that turmeric and curcumin, its active component, both have an effect on the herpes virus, okay? It helps to reduce herpes infection and herpes gene expression, which is very important. And we have numerous articles. Here's one from the National Institutes of Health. Curcumin inhibits herpes simplex virus immediately, early. Okay, we have another article, another National Institutes of Health article, nutraceutical curcumin with promising protection against HSV. Okay. Inhibition of curcumin-treated herpes simplex virus. Curcumin can decrease tissue inflammation. Montclair University. The antiviral activity of curcumin on herpes simplex virus 1. The list goes on and on. As you can see, we have over 10 pages. Each page has 10, 20 results. So you're looking at least at 100, 200 references to this very thing. Now, I want to remind you that, 4 years ago when I did all of this, when I did all this work, a lot of this wasn't here. This evidence for curcumin's and turmeric's action on herpes wasn't as pronounced. I didn't have this many articles. This is a gathering trend. This is something that's building momentum. This is something that's going on, okay? All right. So, this paper, let's just take another look back at this. Let's just take a look at this paper here, right? Let's take a look at this paper from the National Institutes of Health, right? This is also backed by 4 scientists. And it just basically says curcumin, a phenolic compound from the curry spice turmeric, exhibits a wide range of activities in eukaryotic cells, including antiviral effects that are at present incompletely characterized. They're still doing the work. They're still doing the research, okay? Now, I, unfortunately, had to be in the position, I had to do my own work. I had to do my own research, and, in order to fix my particular problems that I was having, right? But you can see in the article right here, it's quite lengthy. It's a good paper, and that's this paper right here. Let's remove this. So there you have it. Okay, let's follow this up with another query. All right, let's follow this up with another query. And by the way, this is something else that's coincidental and quite interesting. After the encephalitis had gone away, okay, for the next, I would say, 2 years, I experienced much more frequent herpes outbreaks than I had in the previous 20 years. Okay, I was getting herpes outbreaks probably once every month, once every 2 months. Right after the herpes simplex encephalitis went away, it was cured. I started to experience herpes outbreaks more often, and this went on once again for a period of 2 years. I would get herpes outbreaks once every, 1 or 2 months. I started medicating those outbreaks with Acyclovir, and at some point I switched from Acyclovir to turmeric, and now I'm at that point where whenever I have an outbreak, I just take turmeric. I don't take the Acyclovir at all. And there's reason for it. You see, if you're like me and you only took Acyclovir when you had outbreaks, let's assume you have an outbreak once every 2 or 3 or 4 years, you're probably not going to have Acyclovir on hand in order to deal with that outbreak. You're going to have to call your doctor. Doctor's going to have to approve a prescription, pick up the prescription, take the Acyclovir. It could take a couple of days, to get that done. If not more, you know. So the way that I see it is, why spend that time suffering, waiting for your Acyclovir prescription, when instead you can just go to the store, get some turmeric, use the turmeric. Honestly, in my experience, it works just as well as the Acyclovir, if not better. It does take more turmeric to do the same job as the Acyclovir. You do have to take more turmeric than Acyclovir, but the results are generally, the same, and like I said, if not even better. So, here we have this. Now, let's ask another question, okay? And this is probably a more important question to ask, okay? Here, hold on a second. Let me copy this and paste it over here. And paste it here. Can turmeric or its active ingredient curcumin cross the blood-brain barrier? Can it do that? Okay, let's find out. And here we see in the AI, let me zoom this in a little bit for you. I want you to see this really clearly. Yes, both turmeric and its active compound curcumin can cross the blood-brain barrier through their bioavailability, the rate and extent to which a substance is absorbed into the bloodstream. Their bioavailability is generally low, okay? Which implies that you have to take even more of it to accomplish the same goals, okay? So, while they can cross the blood-brain barrier, a significant portion of ingested curcumin is not absorbed into the bloodstream and is eliminated from the body, okay? And we can go into a larger dissection of this, but you can find all this information out yourself if you just wanted to look, okay? And here we have an article, once again, from the National Institutes of Health, the effect of curcumin on Alzheimer's disease. So if curcumin can affect Alzheimer's disease in some way by crossing the blood-brain barrier, okay, and it is detected in CSF, as this says right here, detected in CSF, which is cerebrospinal fluid. There are no apparent side effects thus far, GA, upset, chest tightness, none of that, okay? And here it goes on to say, we have one from the Wiley Online Library, neuroprotective effect of curcumin extract in combination, neuroprotection by curcumin. So what you see here, and I'm going to switch once again from, back to the wide shot. So, what you can see by all of this, is that right now, they know that curcumin and turmeric can cross the blood-brain barrier, but what they're really looking for is they're looking for more effective ways of delivering, of ingesting or delivering less curcumin and having it be as effective. So they're looking for more effective delivery mechanisms right now. This is, based on what I've seen. So I understand that, the powers that be, once again, they do not want this turmeric information released. Acyclovir is one of the most popular medications on the planet. It's a huge industry. There's millions, if not billions of dollars at stake. But what is more important, those millions and billions of dollars, or people's lives, people getting better, people having a less hard of a time? I think that's more important. I really do. Right now they're trying to micronize and nanotize the turmeric so that it's, delivered more effectively. They're trying to make a case for patenting this process so that they can then make money on it. This is my perspective. This is how I see things. This is what I think they're trying to do, is they're trying to monetize turmeric. And of course, there'll be FDA regulations. I'm sure they'll start to say, you can only take turmeric for herpes, or you can't take turmeric for herpes at all. Maybe they'll make that kind of law. I don't know, okay? But, they're obviously trying to monetize it right now. And, nobody is happy with just being able to take turmeric in order to regulate your herpes. Nobody's really happy with that scenario in the pharmaceutical world, okay? So, we have all that. Let's go on to a different query. Let's ask another query, okay? Let's ask, I'm going to go on and say something else. It's becoming more and more apparent. It's becoming more and more apparent that my story is entirely plausible. It's quite possibly the only explanation and the most complete explanation for what happened to me, which makes any sense. The sildenafil being the catalyst for the herpes simplex encephalitis by making my blood-brain barrier more permeable. The turmeric's anti-inflammatory properties, its antiviral properties, its ability to cross the blood-brain barrier, which all led to my recuperation and ultimately this video. Ultimately, if all these things didn't happen the way they happened, if somebody else was in charge of all of this, it probably wouldn't have turned out this way. No video would have probably been made, okay? But it just so happens that it happened to me. I'm a reasonably intelligent man. I'm no fool. I'm not, one to quit or take no for an answer. I can do my research. I can do my due diligence, and that's what I did, and that's why we're here. That and the fact that I'm not embarrassed at all by any of this because I've been through the ringer. A little bit of embarrassment doesn't matter to me at all. All the haters, all the trolls, they can say whatever the hell they want. It's not going to bother me in the slightest, no matter what they come up with. And I hope they come up with some good stuff because, honestly, I want to have a good laugh at it too. I haven't been laughing for 5 years. This has been an ordeal for 5 years, And finally, I want to do a little bit of laughing too, even if it's at myself, at my own expense, okay? But let's take this a step further. Excuse me. Again, let's go back to my initial claim that I might have had some kind of mild stroke back in 2018. Let's run the science on that with another few Google search queries, okay? So now that I've switched screens, let's ask the question again. If someone had a 6-week episode of uncontrollable crying that subsided, could it have been caused by a stroke? Could it? Okay, and the AI overview is definitive. It says yes. A 6-week episode of uncontrollable crying that subsided could potentially have been caused by a stroke. And here we have, a link to Health Grades, Managing Involuntary Laughing and Crying After Stroke, pseudobulbar effect, which is, quite common in cases of stroke, at least in the very early beginnings. And then it may go on for the rest of that person's life. They may have pseudobulbar effect. Excuse me, I've got some hiccups right now. Perfect timing, of course. I'm making this video, the most important video of my life, and I'm getting the hiccups, of course. So anyways, pseudobulbar affect, it's concomitant with stroke. We have that situation. Stroke.org, pseudobulbar affect, causes and symptoms and treatment. You can find all this information out yourself. I'm just pointing you in the right direction, all right? Treatment of uncontrolled crying after stroke, National Institutes of Health. Let's take a brief look at this, okay? Uncontrolled crying, this is an abstract by G. Anderson, one scientist, one doctor who wrote this particular abstract, this study. And this was actually back in 1995. This information is over 30 years old. Over 30 years old. So everybody knows about this, I don't understand why I was gaslighted about it. I told them that I've been telling every doctor from the very beginning. I had crying episodes. I had severe paralytic sexual dysfunction, erectile dysfunction, extreme fatigue, other changes in my personality. So anyways, I told them all of this. None of them ever made this connection that I might have had a stroke because of this weird 6-week period of crying. They are completely happy just sending me over to go see a psychiatrist because honestly, then they can just be rid of me. Okay, they don't need to do any further due diligence. They don't need to do any workup. They can just say, "Oh, you told us you had bipolar, right? So it's probably that." They're using my own admission against me. It reminds me of what the police do. When you read your Miranda rights, the doctors are doing something similar. They find themselves being no different. If you have an unusual story, then anything you say can and will be used against you. You told us that you had bipolar. We're going to use that against you in order to make our jobs easier so that we can just collect our pay without doing any further work. Without hearing your story, without listening to what you have to say. You know, it's the height of anti-intellectualism, indecency. It's immoral completely to ignore what the patient is saying when they're completely reasonable. They're completely of their own mind. They know what's going on. I'm going to have to edit this video a little bit because of all this coughing and all this nonsense. I wasn't doing this before, but just so happens when I'm doing a video, all this, surfaces. So anyways, uncontrolled crying, as we can see here, let me zoom in a little bit. Control. Uncontrolled crying after stroke is a disturbance of the motor concomitants of emotional effect. It manifests as stereotyped outbursts of crying that are excessive to an appropriate emotional response, okay, which is exactly what I was having. In my case, however, there are some cases where this crying starts when somebody isn't thinking about anything in particular. They're not thinking about something sad. They're not depressed. Just this crying kind of overtakes them. All right, that wasn't my case. I was actually thinking about something very specific when all of my crying episodes happened for that 6-week period of time. So anyways, once again, the episodes can be triggered by almost any kind of emotional stimulus: happiness, excitement, sadness, just being looked at or talked to, the sight of a doctor, etc., and can even occur without any obvious external or internal stimulus. In my case, I had internal stimulus, but it can happen without it as well. Okay, so here we have that piece of evidence. Let's go look at some more. Let's go look at some more since we're here. Okay, can sexual function... Let's ask this next question. Okay, once again, I'm going to highlight that here. I'm going to pop it into search here. And the question we are asking now is, can sexual function or erectile function become paralyzed after stroke? Which is exactly what I reported. And here we have in the AI overview, yes, sexual dysfunction, including erectile dysfunction, in men is a common issue after stroke and can be a significant concern. Okay, stroke can affect various aspects of sexual function, including libido, which is exactly what I complained about. My libido, was close to zero after my erection, after my supposed stroke, and then it really hit rock bottom after the encephalitis. So it affects erectile capacity and the ability to experience orgasm. My orgasms were also not in great shape after the stroke, but then they got incredibly worse after the encephalitis. Maybe that's something I'll further go into in another video, exactly what that's all about. Anyways, so you see here, and here we have again numerous articles, again in the National Institutes of Health, one of the most, recognized and reliable sources of medical information on the planet. Post-stroke sexual dysfunction in men, epidemiology, intimacy after stroke, American Stroke Association, significant increase of erectile dysfunction in men, after stroke. That's what I'm assuming, since it's part of, the query from Frontiers. And the list goes on. Significant increase of erectile dysfunction in men with multiple etiologies, correlated to stroke. Sex after stroke, it just goes on and on, all right? So this is, I'm not making this stuff up. I had it happen to me, and here we see it in black and white. So let's ask another question, okay? Given all this, right, what else I'd like to ask, is we've seen the evidence so far, right? Okay, but let's take one more quick look. Let's take a look at the extreme fatigue. Let's see if that's also an issue after stroke. Okay, here I have this question here. Let us highlight it, put it into search, and let's ask search. Is extreme and prolonged fatigue associated with stroke? Okay. And here we have it in the AI overview. I don't have to look very far. And this AI overview is backed up by at least 100 references, at least 100 articles. yes, extreme and prolonged fatigue is a common symptom associated with stroke known as post-stroke fatigue. And that's exactly what I was reporting. And it went on for a period of 1.5 years until I got the encephalitis. And after the encephalitis, now I have extreme insomnia. So it completely flip-flopped. You know, it's absolutely a miracle that given all of this, I can still formulate thoughts. You know, I can still create this video. I can still edit it somehow, possibly. You know, I mean, let's take a look at, you know, after all this happened to me, I'm going to round this out here in a little bit. You know, we don't have much further to go. So, you know, yes, extreme fatigue is common experience by many stroke survivors, often referred to as post-stroke fatigue. It's a debilitating and long-lasting condition. So there we have that, okay? And, you know, I understand I sound a little excited, I sound a little frustrated, because once again, I've been gaslighted about this by at least 10 doctors for the last 5 years. And it's finally such a relief to be able to come out and talk about all of this. Anyways, so, you know, here we have that, okay? So we have the extreme fatigue connection. It's all there. It's all there, okay? None of this is hidden. None of this is a mystery. You know, I just had to look in the right places. I had to, you know, understand what was going on with me clearly. That's all I had to do, and all the information is there. All right. So, anyways, without a lot of babbling, you know, you can do your own research if you're so inclined. You know, validate everything I have laid out in the video, you know, for yourself. You know, I want you guys to do that. I want you to do your own homework and validate everything I've said. But this is my true, albeit amazing story, okay? And I happen to be so lucky that, you know, I had this kind of amazing story in my life, you know? I'm the lucky one, you know, so it goes. That's how I'm built, I suppose. I'm able to handle it a little bit better than maybe some other people. I don't know. You know, I know what some of you might be thinking right now, okay? And once again, this is going back to what a lot of physicians have told me in relation to my bipolar disorder. Marat, you told us you were probably bipolar at the very beginning of the video. Don't you know by now that all your symptoms could be explained by a strange bipolar manic depressive episode? Sure it can, okay? And to that I say, lasting 5 years? My 13 symptoms that I had during the acute herpes encephalitis infection, those 13 symptoms, they came and went in the span of those 3 weeks. They arrived and they left as soon as I took the turmeric. Doesn't make any sense, you know? Yes, indeed, if you were to take all of my symptoms and spread them across time, right, then perhaps my bipolar could be an explanation. And, you know, I have had numerous doctors, once again, intentionally use my bipolar condition in order to explain away all of my symptoms so that they could refer me to a psychiatrist, okay? It's an easy out for them. You know, I understand that. You know, but what they could never, ever, ever explain is why my encephalitic symptoms all started after I took the Sildenafil, aka Viagra, and why most of them went away after I took the turmeric, never to come back again. Why did that happen? Nobody has a clue. You know, everybody just points the finger at the bipolar because it's easy. It's easy, and people are all about doing things that are easy for them. You know, why did my extreme fatigue after my supposed stroke become extreme insomnia after the supposed encephalitis? Why did that happen? You know, it's all documented. It's all there, man. I've been fighting this battle for 5 years, and prior to that, you know, I never had a need to see very many doctors. I had my primary care guy in Oakland, and he was great, and he was enough. That was all I needed, right? For the occasional antibiotic or whatever the case may be. So, I mean, you know, come on, have a look. Look, right now, I am taking 5 to 8 pills a night to get maybe 4 or 5 hours of sleep, okay? This is 5 milligrams of prazosin, okay? Here we have that, okay? I'm also taking 50 to 100 milligrams of the doxepin, okay? Prazosin, doxepin. I'm taking 100 milligrams of the Seroquel every single night. And, save the best for last, I'm taking 6 milligrams of Lunesta every single night. Okay? I'm trying to take it down to 4, but sometimes it's effective, sometimes it's not. 6 milligrams of Lunesta. Okay? And I want to remind you all that over the course of the first year and a half after the acute encephalitic infection, I went on a medication excursion trying to find the right combination of meds that would work for me just to control my insomnia. That was my primary concern. That was the biggest thing bothering me. And, I've been on over 40, probably closer to 50, over-the-counter and prescription meds these past 6 years, especially in the first year and a half. And, I've been stable on the Lunesta at 6 milligrams for the last 2.5 years. The largest recommended dose based on guidelines is 3 milligrams, okay? I'm under the impression that if anybody was taking 6 milligrams of Lunesta for 2.5 years, their brains would turn to mush, okay? That's what I'm thinking, all right? Without this medication, I get 1 to 2 hours of sleep a night, if any at all, okay? Without these meds. Without these 4 medications, I only get 1 to 2 hours sleep a night, if any at all. Okay? I've had many sleepless nights because, I didn't have my medications for one reason or another. I'll get into that in another video, As another example, okay, just one more example of what I'm talking about that lends more credibility to the whole story. I went in for my first MRI about a year ago. And, I was quite nervous about it. Everybody was giving me conflicting information. I couldn't find out what it was I was in store for. Anyways, that's a great story in and of itself, probably left for another video. But my neurologist, okay, prescribed me 10 milligrams of Ativan for the anxiety before the MRI. 1 hour before the MRI, I took all 10 milligrams of the Ativan, okay? And it did absolutely nothing as expected. I was up and at 'em. I was happy, of course, because for the first time in 5 years I was getting an MRI, but there was absolutely no sedation happening. This is after 10 milligrams of Ativan within the span of an hour. Okay? Okay. For anybody who knows anything about Ativan, that's a hard act to follow. So anyways, once again, I want to make it clear that I am not a doctor. I am not a nurse. I am not a medical practitioner. And nothing in this video should be construed as medical advice. Okay? I am not offering medical advice. I am offering survival advice. This is about survival. Not painting something in the pretty picture of medicine. This is about survival. All right. I'm not, as you can see, I'm not selling anything. Okay. I'm not affiliated with any turmeric brand, though, I probably wouldn't reject the offer if it came my way. I'm not posting links, to turmeric sites or turmeric products, on Amazon in the description of this video, in any links in this video. I don't have an affiliate partnership with Amazon for turmeric. Okay, all of that is not my goal. It's not my goal to monetize this. Okay, it's not my goal to monetize this. What I really want, and what I'm really hoping for, is that someone out there is going to take this case seriously, and somebody out there will be helped because I told my story. I want researchers to get involved. I want scientists to get involved. I want the medical community to take notice and start a conversation about turmeric, curcumin, and its intersection with herpes simplex encephalitis. Okay? I want papers to be written. I want a study to be done finally, like the study that was recommended in 2017 by those 5 scientists or those physicians. In that very first paper, I pointed out regarding the connection between sildenafil and herpes simplex encephalitis. Okay, Ultimately, what I want is, I want somebody to see this video who's experiencing those acute symptoms right now, and maybe their life will be saved because of it, because they saw this video. That's really what I'm hoping for. I want scientists to get involved and professionals to get involved, but ultimately I want somebody to be helped because of all this. I don't want somebody to have to go through the 5-year firestorm that I had to go through. All right? We need more data. We need more data. Okay? And maybe this video is the video that gets it all going. I hope so. Also, for whoever is watching this, if you have herpes type 1 and type 2 or type 2, and you are taking Viagra or Sildenafil or Tadalafil or Cialis or Levitra, then please be careful. If you start to experience symptoms like the ones I've described after taking any PDE5 inhibitor, okay, get in contact with your doctor immediately. Go to emergency immediately if you can. If you can. Okay? And if you can't, and if you are unable to get to the doctor or to emergency like I was, okay, then go to your grocery store, get the turmeric, try the turmeric. You really have nothing to lose, unless you have an allergy to turmeric. And, that's really uncommon. So, chances are you'll be okay. So again, either this is all incredibly coincidental and ironic, and God is playing the biggest practical joke of all time on me. All right? The biggest practical joke of all time. Or this is Providence. This was meant to be. And I was meant to tell this story. Now, if you've made it this far, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. It's been a long journey for me. Listening to all of this has been a long journey for you. I hope both of us, all of us have gotten something out of all of this. I hope we have. I want to thank you again. Please comment. Please comment on this video. Please subscribe. Follow my journey. Okay? If you're a researcher, a scientist, a medical professional, and you are interested in my experience, please do get in touch. I want to hear from you. I don't want all of this and my struggle these past 5 years to have been for nothing, to have been in vain. I will not go quietly into the night. I will not go without a fight. Okay, I apologize if this has been a little graphic, if at times I've been talking about sexual dysfunction, erectile dysfunction, my erections in particular, which I'm sure nobody wants to hear about. But once again, you're watching Marat in real life. All right, this isn't Marat on the weekends, Marat when he's in a good mood, Marat when he feels like it. This is Marat every day, each and every day, day in and day out. That's what this channel and this video is all about. Okay. Taking everything into consideration, I am here with you right now to tell you this story because for some reason, I was allowed to survive despite impossible odds. Maybe the story is the reason. Just so I can tell this to you folks today. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm still here. For 5 years, I have carried this with me. It's been my burden. It's been my mystery to solve. But by telling you here today, it's not just mine anymore, I'm free of it. It belongs to the world now. This story belongs to all of you now. Do with it whatever you will, whatever you can. My part was to live it and to tell it. Now it's yours. I'm Marat. And again, I thank you for listening. And by the way, the reason why I like this fuzzy microphone cover is because it reminds me of my dog, Dora. I miss her a lot.